Hello and welcome from the First United Methodist Church in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. This is the sixth Sunday of Lent this coming weekend, March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. And that means that next Sunday, the following Sunday, March 24th, is going to be Palm Sunday, which of course is the beginning of Holy Week. So wherever you are, if you're watching this, I want you to know that we will be putting materials online all week long. Keep your eyes open. But even better, if you are in a position to do so, get yourself to a local church and participate in worship. You should be doing that every Sunday. Yeah. I know. But you should. But especially Palm Sunday and Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter. They all go together. That said, if you're close enough to join us for any of those, of course, you're very, very welcome. We have Maundy Thursday communion service, and that'll be at 7 o'clock in the evening. And on Good Friday, the local clergy association participate together in a service at noon at Grace Crossing, which is at the intersection of Church and Gay Streets in Phoenixville. That will be a come and go kind of a service between 12 o'clock and 1:30. For those who are familiar with the term, it'll be a service of the 7 last words. And then we will be holding an event which is primarily a children's event on Holy Saturday. We're calling it Holy Messy Saturday because the event involves more than just an Easter egg hunt, although that's going to be the big part of it, but also crafts and storytelling, music. And some of the crafts are going to get pretty messy, and some of the lessons are going to involve moving around, and we don't know whether that's going to mean having to be inside or if we're outside, there will be dirt, there will be mud, there will be all sorts of things. And so that will be on the morning of Holy Saturday. That evening, we will be participating, or at least I will, at St. John's Lutheran, a couple blocks away from here, in their Easter Vigil, which is beautiful, very liturgical service, very long. Warn you about that. It's very long. That takes place in the evening, looking ahead to Easter morning. Easter morning, we will have 2 services here. One is at 8 a.m., just the other side of that stained glass window. And the second will be on this side of the window, and that will be at 10 a.m. We don't have Sunday school on Easter usually, but we will have plenty of refreshments and plenty of fellowship. So come join us, and we'll be very glad to celebrate Jesus' resurrection with you that day. And if you're somewhere else, chances are that at least 1 or 2 of the additional services during the week will be offered somewhere close to you. Go. Be part of things. He's part of our lives. We need to remember and celebrate his, no less than we would celebrate and remember both the good and sad and troubling and the joyful and the happy, as we would with anyone we loved. Having said that, let's worship together. Hear then these words From the opening of the Gospel of John, verses 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Continuing at verse 14. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory. The glory is the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Knowledge can be taught. Wisdom can only be shared. Knowledge can be memorized, it can be written down, it can be recorded, it can be preserved. Wisdom has to be absorbed, and it has to be nurtured. It has to be given time to deepen and to expand. Knowledge comes from human effort. Wisdom is a gift of God and comes to us through experience. That isn't to say that knowledge is somehow worth less than wisdom. We need both. Miles Kington, a British journalist, is the person attributed with the observation, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not putting it into a fruit salad. I would push that a little bit farther. I would say that foolishness is making a tomato smoothie. But wisdom is knowing that you can heat it up and call it soup. There's nothing wrong about knowing something. The desire to learn is in itself admirable. In fact, willing ignorance, not wanting to learn, not wanting to see what's around you, closing your eyes to facts, that's downright foolishness, the opposite of wisdom. A rejection not only of wisdom, but of knowledge, both of them at the same time. And even worse is when somebody will elevate ignorance to the level of a virtue and brag about how they have managed to keep their minds closed, as if the world itself, the entire world, the universe, were not a gift from God to be explored with our senses and with our minds, and to be viewed and heard with a sense of wonder, a sense of awe, curiosity, and reverence. Human intelligence has its limits, though. We've explored physics enough to understand what the world is made of, down even to a subatomic level. But in doing that, we've managed also to discover things that we need to leave alone. Not that we don't need to know about, but things we don't want to know and shouldn't know firsthand. What happens when you split an atom? If it's at a nuclear power plant, fine. If it's somewhere else, not fine. We've studied biology enough to know how it is, how different patterns of DNA can be from one another, and how similar they may be. We've come to look at these things and say, okay, now we recognize the patterns that will take the same chemicals and turn this mixture into a cedar tree and that mixture into an elephant. But when we go down to that level and look at things closely enough, as much as we have discovered, and as closely as we've mapped out the processes of life and of living, we still are not able to say, and I don't think we ever will be able to say, when that little tiny clump of undifferentiated cells becomes a human being. That may not be a question for science and the kind of knowledge that it represents. There's knowledge and there's wisdom. Wisdom, in some ways, is a commentary on knowledge. It observes and it recognizes that there are things we don't know. And it begins to ask questions that give us guidance and that say, well, okay, given the knowledge we have, what do we do with it? Wisdom, I believe, lies in accepting the limitations of human knowledge, as well as recognizing its difficulties. And wisdom looks beyond human guidance to try to tell us what to do with what we know, sometimes what not to do with what we know, and what to do with the aspects of our lives that we struggle to understand and maybe never will understand. And that is where the theological begins. That is where, from my perspective as a Christian, the Christian doctrine of the incarnation comes in. The belief that God does not hold himself apart from this whole struggle between knowledge and wisdom and our own struggle to understand how to live. That God doesn't stay aloof from his own creation as a whole, and even comes to our aid. I'll use the language, comes to save us. Save us from our own sin, our getting it wrong, our own foolishness, our own denial of wisdom. And that God does that not by staying out there as some sort of object of speculation, looking back on us, but by becoming part of his own creation, by becoming a human being, one we name as Jesus. God doesn't simply make us wise by telling us what we're to do, giving us all the rules and the regulations and the guidelines, the laws, the best practices. And when that's what we look for, we get ourselves into trouble. God jumps into the midst of human life instead. A life where sometimes the rules and the regulations bump up against other realities and bump up against mercy, compassion, understanding. Not mental understanding, but being understanding of one another or of ourselves. It's a complicated world. And God is right in the midst of it all. In the person of Jesus. The way that John tries to say that is this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him is life, and life was the light of all people. God's creation has never been static. It has never been lifeless. It has never been pointless. The universe is not some cold, unfeeling process. The universe is a creation of God, and we may see it, as we necessarily will, being limited beings. We may see a small part of it for a small moment, and there's always more than meets our eyes or our understanding. But it's alive. And not for any reason other than God gives it life and keeps things going. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. And the Word became flesh. Here's flesh, us. The Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have beheld his glory. The glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. You want to find truth. You can find things that are true with your mind. You can verify things, and should. But truth, in its widest sense, in its fullest nature, is something that goes beyond what we see, what we feel, what we touch, what we can conceive of with our minds, it's not apart from all of those things. But it's become a part of all of those things. Starting out as something before things. The biblical commentator William Barclay puts it this way. You're going to have to pardon some of the language here. It's from the 1950s. He said, "Ever since men began to think about God, they've been trying to define just who and what he is, and their puny minds get no nearer a definition. But we can cease our thinking and look at Jesus Christ and say, that's what God is like. Jesus didn't come to talk about God. He came to show what God is like, so that the simplest mind might know him as intimately as the mind of a great philosopher." God comes to us and doesn't hold anything back. God's whole self, God's whole being, God's heart, all of his love, all of his wisdom, all of his creativity is brought to bear on human life in Jesus, in the one who is both God and human, the Word made flesh, that lived among us, full of grace and truth. Now, when I say it's brought to bear on all of our lives, all is a very loaded word. In the one sense, it means the life of each of us, but in another sense, it also means on all, the entirety of each life. And all of our lives, all of our life, includes things we're not happy about, things that give us problems, our weakness, our troubles, even our death. At the beginning of this video, you heard on the piano the old spiritual, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrow. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus." And he does. When God became human, when God became Jesus, he took on him all of that, all of our human nature, and all that goes with it, all of what it is to live as a human being. It would mean that we would treat him the way we treat each other, which, if you haven't noticed, can be terribly brutal. God entered his own world full of knowledge that things would go wrong, that he would be rejected, that he would be abused, that he would be killed. God entered the world with a wisdom that accepted the loss of everything as the way to reach out to us in our human condition, our sin, our foolishness. Would we call that wise? From a human perspective, a God who is almighty may not be wise if he doesn't act almighty. And this whole business that we saw in Jesus of God going to the cross is a major embarrassment, a scandal Scandal, by the way, is here's a little moment of knowledge. Scandal is from the Greek word scandalon, which means a stumbling block, something you trip over, something that makes you fall and bump your head, something that knocks you to the ground, something that gets in the way. A scandal. As in, we proclaim Christ crucified. A stumbling block to Jews, a scandalon, and foolishness to the Gentiles. Those were Paul's words. And there is something scandalous and something just totally inconceivable and just put it this way, illogical. Illogical. When Jesus hung on the cross dying, there were people who were standing by who mocked him. And what they said was, he saved others, he cannot save himself. The King of Israel, let him come down from the cross now and we'll believe in him. Well, there's your chance. But no, he didn't do that. And you could, if you wanted, go on and find contradiction after contradiction after contradiction. There is a logical disconnect between being almighty and being crucified. And it makes no human sense. However, it makes no sense only if you don't add in the unaccountable factor of love. When God became human, he became fully human. But what is it to be fully human if it's not to love? And the fully human Jesus was also fully God. And within him was not only human love, but the kind of love that made the universe to begin with. A kind of love that is infinitely far beyond what we, human beings, even at our best, could ever begin to comprehend. A light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome. What Jesus shows us about God, not just tells us, but shows us, demonstrates, is God's love and the solidarity that it creates with us. You stick with the people you love. You keep them close to you. You stay together. That's what love does. It draws people together. And the love that was there on the cross is a kind of love that draws all things together. It asks of God to love us, to forgive. And it asks of us to love God and to love one another, to be in it together, all of us. Megan McKenna shares a story of an American woman named, appropriately enough as it turned out, Sister Mary Antoinette. She was part of an order of nuns that were called the Daughters of Wisdom. She was a missionary who was serving in the Congo in the 1960s when Patrice Lumumba was busily trying to create a communist nation there, which of course would be an atheist nation and which of course would be fighting back against all forms of Western imperialism even in religion. It became dangerous for Westerners, even nuns, to stay. But they did, and she did among them. She wrote to her sisters on Long Island at one point, and she said, God alone knows what will be the ending of all this chaos and strife, but whatever we do now will be a beginning. In October of 1964, her community, which included a school, a hospital, and an orphanage, was captured. 46 nuns were taken captive and held by armed men. Eventually, 44 of them would be found, but two would not. One was a Belgian nun, and the other was Sister Mary Antoinette. Both of them were killed in terrible ways, and their bodies were thrown into the Congo River. Explaining Mary Antoinette's refusal to leave the community, as she knowingly faced the danger that they knew was coming to them, McKenna connects it to Jesus' incarnation and to his refusal to turn away from any of us in our need, even on the cross. McKenna wrote, "The mission work is not necessarily what you do or even what you say. More than anything else, it is one's very presence among people. This wisdom makes one the message and the messenger, and it binds one in the blood of the cross, in the power of the resurrection, in every generation and every part of the world." Things need not go so far as martyrdom for Jesus' followers to live out that kind of wisdom, but it's still the wisdom of the cross. It's there whenever somebody chooses to stick with somebody who is going through a troubled portion of their life and to do what they can. They can't always do much. Sometimes they can do nothing, but to stick with them as they go through it. The wisdom is there whenever somebody takes a low-paying job instead of a more high-status one because they know they'll do more good. Or they sense that somehow they're serving God's children. It's there whenever somebody sets aside the easier way in favor of the better way. Those choices are never foolish as long as they are done with the one ingredient that turns the cross into a moment of redemption, of salvation. The one ingredient that is the love of God, who first loved us. Amen.